Today we'll be talking about agricultural systems and genetically modified organisms. So before we do that, we want to take an opportunity to talk about agriculture, what it was like before we had agriculture, how agriculture came to be through the process of domestication, and then move a little onto modern agriculture where we're using things such as pesticides to improve crop yields, etc., and what can go wrong with that. And then finally, we'll talk about genetic engineering and GMOs. But first, let's go way back. And a little reminder, when last we talked about evolution, we talked about humanity beginning, as we had our origins as a species here in Africa, and we migrated out of Africa due to likely food shortages that would have come about as a byproduct of climate change. Of course, a very different kind of climate change than what we're experiencing today. Back then, we're talking about ice ages. But it's having a similar effect today, and that is that whenever you dramatically change the climate that's been stable for thousands of years, you end up with a disruption to the plants and animals and those complex systems that occur between them. And so food was becoming scarce for the early humans living in this area, so they began to slowly kind of move to different areas, and you'll see this took a long time. We're talking about thousands of years ago. I want to make sure you understand the perspective here. These arrows make it look like we're going on a road trip today. We might imagine driving or flying. You can make it in a few hours, but when you're talking about, people picking up and moving everything they have, we're talking about these tiny incremental little steps that would have taken many, 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 perhaps hundreds or even thousands of generations in order to get very far. I mean, notice the difference by the time they're getting, through parts of Asia and here. This was 10,000 years ago where they would have left some probably 60, 70,000 years ago. So when you think of our human history, it only goes back 12,000 years. So these are vast amounts of time. And so that kind of helps you to understand. So 12,000 years ago is an important number. I remember this because I think of 10,000 BC. Terrible movie, by the way. But it makes it easy to remember. Because remember, BC, before Common Era, so 10,000, then you have to add the 2,000 for while we're in the Common Era, or AD. That's for a total of about 12,000 years ago is when we think agricultural systems began to be developed. Now, these would have happened on their own. It wouldn't have been like someone learned about this and decided they wanted to implement it. People had to discover this. We take for granted the knowledge we have now. Even a young kindergartner may understand that if you plant a seed, you'll get a plant. But there would have been a point in history where people would have had to have learned that for the first time. So if you go back prior to this era of that kind of knowledge, before we had agriculture, you had our early humans, and these would have been people just like us. At 12,000, 20,000, 30,000 years ago, these were anatomically modern humans. They would have looked just like you and me. There would have been really no difference at all physiologically. So imagine us, living in various parts of the world back then. By 12,000 years ago, people had inhabited pretty much the entire planet. If you'll refer back to this slide that shows the map, you'll see that they had gotten just about everywhere by 10, 12,000 years ago. One of the last places inhabited would have been way over here to South America, but they're thinking they probably made it there by 12, 13,000 years ago. So prior to that time, as they're spread throughout the planet, humans then were hunter-gatherers. So they would have followed the animals. They would have moved around gathering plants that they knew that they could eat, knowledge that had been passed on from parent to child for many, many generations. And it was a difficult lifestyle. If the food wasn't there, if crops didn't, or they wouldn't have been crops, if plants didn't grow where they expected, they wouldn't have them. If animals did not migrate through where they normally would, there wouldn't be meat there. And this is what was happening that encouraged people to move away from Africa initially. And of course, as you move away to other parts of the world, you encounter different types of plants and animals, and people adapted to those. We were, using all kinds of tools, because remember, we were modern humans then. We certainly didn't have the knowledge that we have now, but we had the capability. People had the same intellect, or at least potential for it, as we do now. So we were using various tools, and we would have had society, complex social interactions. They would have been different because, of course, we had different experiences. But nonetheless, we were a social animal just as we are today. we lived in groups, little tribes or villages, probably fairly small groups initially. You wouldn't have large cities and things because there'd be no way to support that many people, because they had to be able to move from place to place in order to gather the food and hunt the food they needed. So about 10,000 BC, which is 12,000 years ago, the changes that occurred there, that is what has made it possible for us to live in cities today, densely populated into small geographic areas. And that change was agriculture. And they figured out ways to grow crops in a given location and concentrate those crops so that they weren't gathering, a piece of wheat here and then scattered among all these other plants, and oh, here's another wheat plant, you get a few more heads of wheat there. And that's what they would have had to have done initially to get wheat, which was a naturally occurring plant, right? They would have had to have traveled over large areas looking through lots of other things, lots of other plants, and picked up the things they want while ignoring things we might think of as weeds or wildflowers or whatever. So it was a lot more labor intensive. When they figured out that they could plant those seeds and then they would have a field that was mostly wheat, they didn't have to travel so far. They got a lot more wheat for the same amount of work. So that concept of growing crops is really what we mean specifically when we talk about agriculture, and that absolutely changed the world. I mean, I can't overstate that. It's probably the biggest breakthrough in all of humanity, rivaled very closely by maybe the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so the way that this was possible was some 12,000 years ago, they began to discover that we could modify the plants and in fact the animals. We could select for certain characteristics or traits that were desirable to us, and if we planted the seeds of those desirable plants, we got more and more of the desirable traits in the future generations. And that was a huge breakthrough for them, because they wouldn't have known this initially. It was probably an unintentional, accidental sort of find. Maybe they were out hunting, or gathering plants, and they found some new novel or much loved berry, say, okay, and they ate bunches of them. They had a feast, and there was fire and music, right? You can imagine the whole tribal thing. And they would have put their trash in some area off to the side of camp, like a garbage area. Well, they were still moving from place to place. They were migratory, so they probably had summer campsites and winter campsites, and they would move to these different sites. So imagine when they came back the next year, and they would have known that this great berry that they found the previous year, that they're probably still talking about because it was so awesome, right? That they had to travel far and wide to find last year. Well, now that plant is growing where they left their trash last year, almost if by magic, right? Well, they would have over time figured out, if you leave parts of the plant in an area, then you're going to get more of those plants. Initially, there would have been different understandings of how that happened. They probably would have thought things like some kind of nebulous, maybe the spirit of the plant or something along those lines was, reborn. Eventually, they began to figure out specifically that it was the seeds in certain parts of the plants, right, that you could take and plant those. So once they figured this out, it was huge for them, because they could take the seeds from plants like wheat here, and they could plant those seeds, and next year there'd be a bunch of them. Now, if you're looking at this slide and you see all of these wheat seeds here, you imagine, well, which one is going to be the best to eat? You may not know much about wheat, but just looking here, you're going to say, oh, I bet it's this one. This big one here. Look at the size of that kernel, right? And that's how we would have likely selected for things initially. We would have selected for the desirable trait. In this case, the desirable trait was a big old kernel, because that's where the flour comes from. This, by the way, is the seed, okay? What they do is they grind up the seed of these wheats and they make flour out of it, which can be used to make bread and stuff. Well, they would have had to have had a lot of discipline early on to save some of these really nice kernels. Imagine, it's a tough sell to the village, right? No, let's not eat these really great seeds. Let's save them and sprinkle them back on the ground. People probably thought they were crazy at first, but then when they began to see more and more of these really big kerneled wheats growing in subsequent years, they figured out, hey, this is the way to go, because then all the wheat that we get, or at least a lot of it, is going to be better. And so they would have done this over and over time they would see a change. Now, we did this for plants and animals. You can see that dogs were one of the earliest animals to be domesticated probably about the time agriculture was occurring, about 12,000 years ago. Cats were probably right around that same time period, although there's a lot of evidence now that this actually was happening perhaps much earlier than this. It's hard to know for sure, but we find bones that go back farther back than this, so indicating that probably there would have been tribes that had dogs living with them well before this, but it was probably very common by the time agriculture was getting hold. And then, over the ensuing, millennia, and remember, we're talking thousands of years. If you think back 2,000 years ago, that would have been about the time of Jesus. 4,000 years ago, we're talking about the great pyramids in Egyptian times and these, ancient civilizations that you learn about. That's only, 3, 4, 5, 6,000 years ago. Not really that long ago compared to how long people have been around. If you look at the times between these, you see that a lot of time is going by. So that's part of how this works. It just takes a long time for these changes to occur. You do not need to know, by the way, these dates or these places of origin. It's really more just for your information because it's interesting. One of the things I find interesting about the plants here, you can see that a number of these plants that we're so familiar with, like wheat, for instance, would have come from Southwest Asia. Rice from China, that probably doesn't surprise you much. Maybe it surprised you that corns and beans and squash come from here in the New World, okay, in the Americas. Now they're ubiquitous throughout the world, but these would have been things that they would have had here in the Americas. And agriculture was occurring independently throughout the world starting about 12,000 years ago. It didn't only begin in the Fertile Crescent, like we all learned, in history, right? The Fertile Crescent, that's where all this began. Well, it did begin there, but it was going on in other parts of the world too. In Asia, it was going on in a New World in the Americas about the same amount of time ago. So it's kind of interesting that, it was independently being developed across the world because there would have been no way, no mechanism for people to travel that far within, individual lifetimes. All right. So let's talk about what happens when we do domesticate something. One of the things that we choose when we're domesticating crops are how nice is this crop? Do they have the traits that we really desire? Is it that big kernel of wheat? Is it a nice juicy tomato? Whatever it might be, we are selecting for productivity and for appeal, how tasty it is, whatever. But we're not thinking about things like how good a fit is it to the environment? Is it drought resistant? Does it resist pests naturally? That would not have been a consideration early on, and it had some serious ramifications. The best example of this would have been the Irish potato famine that would have occurred in Ireland, as you can see here. Now, the thing about it was it turns out potatoes are a great source of calories, right? Which is a problem today when we eat too many of them and we get overweight, but they would have been great for people that were on the brink of starvation, right? You grow potatoes, you get a dense food source. Well, potatoes, some of them will grow pretty well in Ireland, but not all of them. And remember, if you look back to that slide here for where things came about, the potato, you see, some 3,500 years ago was domesticated in the Andes Mountains. So that's going to be South America. So over the ensuing millennium, we would have gotten potatoes here to Europe. Okay, and so they're not native to Ireland. And there are thousands of varieties of potatoes in the Andes. There's a huge diversity of them, but only some of them would grow well in Ireland. They had a small selection of potatoes, and essentially they were having what we call now a monoculture, meaning they were all one variety of potatoes that they were growing here in Ireland. Well, along comes a fungus, okay, and this fungus infected the potatoes and it killed them. Boom, the entire crop is destroyed because after all, they're all the same variety, so that means they're all susceptible to the same fungus. So when the potato crop is destroyed, then what you get here is people starving. So about 1 million people died, and about another 1 million people had to leave Ireland. This is when we saw a big pulse of immigrants coming to the United States and to other parts of the world also, because they were literally starving because one of the food crops they depended on so heavily was now wiped out. So if you think about pests, a pest is just simply something that we as humans don't want around. But the reality is that they're just other parts of the world, of the ecosystem, of natural environment. You've got insects and various other animals that eat plants, and And that's just, the way it is in nature, that, everything has a place. And so when we create these large fields, these crops, this is not natural, okay? And so just like it provides, this rich bounty for humans to go through and get a bunch of wheat or corn or whatever we're harvesting, well, it does so for the pests too. They don't have to travel as far either. It's like, wow, look, as far as we can see, it's all this plant we love to eat so much. And so you get populations of these pests just exploding. So we figured out that, okay, if we're going to make this easier for us, we're making it easier for the pests too. And because we were selecting plants based on their appearance and not on how pest resistant they were, we ended up with a real problem with pests. And so we came up with a solution. Well, early on, the solution, initially the solution was hard work and labor. You got rid of the pests manually, and that was very labor intensive, lots of people having to work, and that kind of negated some of the benefit of agriculture. Well, so after the Industrial Revolution, when we began to see more and more chemicals come onto the scene, this became the new solution. So DDT was an early pesticide that came about that was widely used in this area, and it was considered sort of a miracle pesticide at the time because they assumed it was safe. The farmers loved it because if you spread DDT on the crops, they found that it was going to kill these pests very effectively, and that is exactly what it did. Now, we have this sort of if a little is good, more is better kind of mentality. So they began to just spray large quantities of this pesticide over the entire fields here. And when this occurred, we began to overuse it. And so we were wiping out populations of pests. Okay, so these caterpillars are just one example, for instance, that they would have been, mostly killed by DDT. But imagine the ones that weren't killed, and there would have been some that had some natural resistance to DDT. They survived. And so you had these populations, in this case, they're, shown by like a little red dot there. Initially, there was maybe just one red dot among a whole bunch of white, kind of normal looking pests, right? And so the DDT is applied, and it kills off virtually all of the pests. But the one that was red, the one resistant, survived. And over time, you begin to develop a larger concentration, a larger percentage of the population would have been resistant to the DDT until, in the end, most of the pests would have been resistant to it. And it's the same concept of bacteria developing resistance to antibiotics. The same thing happens with these pests. Now, there's another problem with using pesticides like DDT, and that is that they can magnify. Now, biomagnification specifically means that as you move through the different food chains, you begin to see different concentrations of the pesticide. So, for instance, at the bottom of the food chain, when you have these tiny zooplankton, these little nearly microscopic animals that would have been food sources for slightly larger things like small fish, they would have picked up a tiny bit of DDT. Not enough to really do much, but you consider that these small fish have to eat lots and lots of these zooplankton, okay? And that's going to magnify all the DDT in the small fish. Well, then you have larger fish that eat those smaller fish, but those larger fish have to eat a bunch of small fish. So they get all the DDT that's in all those small fish, and remember, they had gotten all the DDT that was in all that zooplankton. And on it goes until you get to the top of the food chain, like an osprey, which is a big bird that's going to go through and catch these large fish. Well, think of other large animals that catch large fish, like people, right? We're at the top of the food chain, so the fish and food that we would eat would also be potentially dangerous. And we'll talk about that in a future lecture, so keep that in mind. But osprey didn't really, get people's hearts and imaginations, right? But the bald eagle did, because of course this is the United States bird, right? And it was widely distributed through the U.S. But then the numbers began to drop precipitously in the 60s here, and that was because we were using so much DDT. Now it turns out that what happens is the DDT will biomagnify in these fish, and the bald eagles will eat these fish, and so the bald eagles get a high concentration of DDT inside their tissues. And when the female bald eagles will lay eggs, those eggs don't have a proper shell formed around them because the DDT changes the sort of biochemical pathways in their bodies, and they don't make good eggshells. So when they sit down on the eggs to keep them warm, like a mother bird does, they would actually crack the eggs. And so you ended up with these baby birds not being born. So we were seeing a reduction in the baby bird population, which was causing the overall population to go down, because as aging bald eagles would die, there wouldn't be enough new babies to take their place. And so at one point, this population had declined to the point of only having a few hundred pairs left, and they were an endangered species, thought to be on the brink of extinction. So the Environmental Protection Agency banned DDT in 1972, and sure enough, as a result, in the years following that, we saw a rebound in the population, because now the adult bald eagles were not eating fish that were as contaminated with DDT, because it was getting out of the environment slowly but surely, and that meant their shells were being made properly and the babies were being born normally again. So now these birds are back to a fairly good number. They're still considered threatened, although they may even have been taking off that now. I'll have to check that, but nonetheless, they are not at risk of extinction as they had been at one point. So that brings us to the real topic for today, and that's genetic engineering. So it's probably no surprise to you the United States is the world leading producer of genetically modified crops. You know, a lot of the technology begins here and spreads to other parts of the world. And many of the foods that you are very familiar with eating are going to be genetically modified. Quite a large percentage of them, actually. And if you'll see the graph there that compares some of them, we actually, this is worldwide, we probably get the majority of our soybeans, that's what soya is, from genetically modified. Now, that seems and sounds scary, right? But it doesn't have to be. As you read from your article, there's sort of some bad press about GMOs, and that's because there's a lack of understanding of what it is. It's such a broad umbrella term. It's not really fair to just lump everything in all as one GMO, because it stands for genetically modified organism. An organism could be any kind of plant or animal, right? And genetically modified just means that we are modifying the genes, right, the DNA. Well, that sounds very scientific, and it is. It's not fundamentally that different, at least in terms of the end result, compared to what traditional breeding practices that were a part of domestication did for, and have done for millennia here. They would select for certain traits, so we were sort of manually selecting traits that occurred on their own in the wild, maybe for larger kernels of wheat, for instance, right? And we would select those. And that's a process called artificial selection, okay? And that artificial selection would result in a magnification of those genes. We were modifying the genes, but we were doing it kind of the old school way. So what we now can do is we can isolate certain regions of DNA, and we can insert them manually into the DNA of whatever crop we want. So some of these insertions, some of these GMOs are not particularly troublesome. They might be for certain traits that you might get just through natural breeding processes. It's just this is an easier way to accomplish it. And few people would have really much problem with that kind of GMO. There are others, though, that are a bit more worrisome. Okay, this is where the transgenic GMOs come into mind. And trans refers to coming from another organism. So you're taking genes from one organism, one plant or animal, and you're putting it into a different species. And sometimes this can be really different, okay? It's potential, or it has a lot of potential even to put, toxins, say from a bacteria, into, a plant like corn. And this is widely done because there are certain bacteria that will release these toxins that will kill pests. And so if pests begin to, eat like a crop that has this, then what will happen is the pests will die. Okay, well, that's good for the productivity, but people may worry, well, what about this toxin in here? If you're actually growing a plant that's producing its own toxin, like sort of from the inside out, right? People worry though, what kind of health consequences might that have? And so far with the GMOs that are like this that we've used, there's really been no scientific connection to any health problems, not in the concentrations that we eat them in for sure. But there are those that are just opposed to this on sort of a general ethical stance that it's tinkering with nature, and it kind of is. But there's some real reasons for this, and so let's talk a little bit more about this. So a lot of times the reasons that people would want to modify the genes in the first place is because we need to improve productivity. We need more of these crops to grow and not fall prey to pests and disease and things, because otherwise we will potentially run out of food. Now that comes up against this very different problem and these people that are very much against transgenic organizations. They will lump all GMOs together, and they'll use, scary words like Farmageddon, and Frankenfood and stuff, with meant to be, of course, very derogatory, because it's like you're mixing and matching genes from different species. Well, that can be worrisome, because that can, escape the controlled population that you're growing it in, and those genes could potentially incorporate into the wild crops, and then, they get out of hand and you can't stop them. That is a real concern with this type of thing. But the reality is, this is not what most of the GMOs that you hear about are all about. So, GMOs that are in like our grain crops that you would find in like Triscuits and whatever. I don't even know for sure if they have those, so I probably shouldn't use that example. But many of the foods that we would buy that use grains, probably most of them are from GMO crops, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're that troublesome, because they're not this. They're not this transgenic type of situation. Okay, now that leads us to the food crisis. So we don't see this too much going on in the United States. We are very much sheltered here, okay? But in other parts of the world, there's a genuine shortage of food. And it's bad now, but it's getting worse because the population is really, really growing. We're sitting at about 7 billion people now, and it's expected to grow significantly, to add a few billion more people in just the next 20, 30 years. Okay, so that's going to be a problem. We are going to have to increase food supply quite a bit in order to meet the need, to get them to all the people that need to get to. And probably the only way we're going to be able to do that, at least that we can see at this point, is to utilize more GMOs, because we can get a higher productivity out of them. Now, in a bit of an ironic twist here, and this is what the article was about, using GMOs has actually resulted in a reduction in pesticide use, so in insecticides specifically. So these would be poisons that will kill insects. And that's a good thing, because we are pretty closely related, at least closer related to an insect than, say, another plant. Because the other thing is that using GMOs has resulted in an increase in herbicide use, so poisons that kill plants. Herbicides in general are much less toxic to humans than insecticides. So it's better for humans to be exposed to herbicides and insecticides. Ideally, neither is good, right? Because they're both poisons. And so GMOs are split. You're using fewer pesticides, that's good, but you're using more herbicides. In fact, a lot more herbicides. All right, so it's not a simple matter of, yes, no, right, or wrong, but nonetheless, it's also not as evil as many people make it out to be. So hopefully you're a little more informed about what GMOs are in general. And when we see you again, we will talk about exotic species. It's a fun lecture. You're not going to miss that one. Hope y'all have a great weekend.